In the previous part, I shared my experience in deducing that the universe had been created by a personal, uncaused first cause. But how did I discover who this mysterious creator was? Has the creator revealed their identity to the world? How do we come to know the true creator and not some false idea about God? At the age of 12, I began my search for the identity of the Creator. I quickly found that there are more religions than I could count on my fingers. I had to figure out a better way of examining all these belief systems by their general worldviews, rather than judging each one by their superficial differences, which would take a dozen lifetimes of dedication and insanity. I decided to categorize them by their fundamental principles. All the world religions can be classified into four basic groups: atheistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, and monotheistic. We've already covered that the atheistic worldview is false. But how would I determine the validity of the other groups? I thought of three factors by which to find the most truthful worldview: power, logical consistency, and empirical evidence. Factor 1: Power. The greatest miracle of all, which is the creation of the physical universe, must be the result of an all powerful being, a great being which could not be contested by any other lesser being. This rules out every polytheistic religion in one swoop. Polytheism is the belief that there are many, many different gods, and each one is responsible for some element of the universe. And if you go back into the polytheistic religion's mythological lore and rationale, you will find that the first gods are not as powerful as they seem. The first gods have to create more gods because the first gods can't handle all the work involved in creating and maintaining a universe. The first gods didn't have the time or energy to run the world. This means that the first gods were not competent as they had limitations and inabilities to do things they should have been easily able to do on their own. These polytheistic deities couldn't run the world they created. Polytheistic gods are incomplete, low-level beings. Nothing about them screams phenomenal cosmic power. Therefore, it is most probable that there aren't many gods, but only one God. Also, when you think of the uncaused first cause, it makes sense that such a being would be perfection. You're probably wondering why I use the term perfection instead of perfect. In my thinking, the creator of all things could not be perfect in the sense that God meets a high or higher standard outside of himself. Rather, he is the standard. He is perfection itself. The standard exists not because of a decision made by God, but because of his very nature. Perfection exists because God exists. Wisdom, for example, is an abstract concept. We as humans strive for wisdom because it is beyond us. We have to reach out for it. The true God doesn't reach out for wisdom as if it's above him or beyond him. In fact, wisdom comes from God. In this way, we could say God is wisdom. Just the same, God is love. God is light. God is joy. God is peace, God is justice, and God is truth. All these good things come from God as He is the source of them. The same could not be said about the many lowercase g gods. This removes religions such as Greek, Roman, Nordic, Egyptian, and 95% of all other religions that believe in a multi God worldview. Factor 2: Logical consistency. I don't think it to be surprising that the law of non-contradiction should apply to, or better yet, stem from God. We shouldn't be finding contradictions in a worldview. Pantheism suggests that the universe is God, or is a greater manifestation of God, and everything and everyone is God, and God is everyone and everything. Can you smell the confusion yet? This worldview ends up with a universe full of logical contradictions. We know the physical universe has limitations, so that would mean that the pantheistic God is limited. The universe is chock full of evil and chaos and hatred, so that means the pantheistic God is evil, chaotic, and made of hatred. The universe had a beginning, which implies that the pantheistic God also had a beginning. This is self-contradicting because if the pantheistic God is not outside of the universe, then he is by default a part of the creation of the universe, meaning that the pantheistic God is a created God, which would beg the question, who created the pantheistic God? Pantheism is well decorated like polytheism, but it has the same limitations and flaws of atheism. You can start to see how pantheism is total nonsense. This all tells us that the true God would have to be outside of the universe and have authority over it, not being limited or bound by the laws of the material plane. Pantheism is also false. Our search has narrowed down to the monotheistic religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Factor 3. Empirical evidence. Since it is more probable that there is only one God who created the universe, which would have to have been made good from the beginning, it would stand to reason that this God desires the thing that was created, which would rule out the idea of deism, a monotheistic belief which means that God created the universe and left it alone because he lost interest in it. Logically, God would only create with purpose, something that God desires. Is it possible that this God has revealed to creation the identity of its creator? Do we have any reliable records of an all powerful monotheistic creator giving revelation of himself to us? Well, the only documents that meet such criteria are the Gospels. The reason we can trust the Gospels comes twofold: A, historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels, and B, the character of Jesus Christ. Both reasons remove doubt that the Judeo Christian God is the true creator of the universe. The historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels. How do we know whether a document or a copy of an original document from thousands of years ago is reliable? There are two questions that historians ask. Is the record accurate, and is the record truthful? Take the ancient literary works of Homer. You have probably seen the film Troy, the character Achilles starring Brad Pitt, and Odysseus starring Sean Bean. These two characters are based off the epic called the Iliad. Ancient scribes would write copies of the original Iliad, and when the original was lost to the degradation of time, the scribes would make more copies from the earlier copies. We have about 1,800 manuscripts of the Iliad in current existence. All these manuscripts help clarify the textual accuracy of the literary work, meaning that the more copies we have, the more we are able to reconstruct a document that is as close to the original as possible. Another test of accuracy is the date in which the early copies were written. The earliest surviving copy of the Iliad was written in the 3rd century BC. Here is where we find our first problem. Homer, the alleged author, lived in the 8th century BC, about 400 years prior to the earliest record we have of the Iliad. And yet, we as a society trust the accuracy of a text written 400 years after the author lived and having only about 1,800 copies. The accuracy of most ancient records has not been preserved as well as Homer's Iliad had. However, we now have to ask the question of the literature's truthfulness. The Iliad, like most epic poems of the ancient world, dealt with a great deal of supernatural phenomena such as the actions of multiple gods upon mankind. Never mind the absurdity of the polytheistic worldview. The work has failed to maintain truthfulness in its historicity. Separate the work from all its drama and mythology, and you're left with a history that holds no water according to archaeology and other historic data. Homer's Iliad is textually accurate, but not empirically truthful, and therefore is not historically reliable. Let's move on to the Gospels and see how they fare against the same testing. The New Testament has been preserved in over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and over 9,300 manuscripts in other ancient languages such as Syriac, Slavic, and Gothic. There are in total more than 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament writings. Of those 25,000, more than 2,000 contain the Gospel writings. These manuscripts outnumber every other ancient work of literature. Almost all biblical scholars agree that these manuscripts can reconstruct the originals with more than 99% accuracy. On top of the mass amounts of correctly copied manuscripts, we also have very early dating of the manuscripts. It's well known among scholars and historians that almost all of the New Testament books and letters were written within the 1st century, before AD 100. How do we know this? Because early church leaders such as Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna writing between the years 8095 and 110, quoted passages from what we know to be the New Testament. Archaeologist William F. Albright wrote, "We can say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. Albright also wrote, "In my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and 80s of the first century." Here's something that will blow your mind. Early church leaders of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others, quoted the New Testament over 36,000 times. In fact, even if we didn't have the manuscripts, the entire New Testament can be reconstructed, except for 11 verses, just from the quotations found in the early church fathers' writings. Thankfully, we have both early manuscripts and validated quoted scripture by the early church leaders. The textual accuracy is very good, but how about truthfulness? How do we know if something in the past happened? A great piece of evidence is personal testimony. You know what is better than one personal account of events? Many personal accounts. The testimonies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the accounts of Apostle Paul and Peter refer to many details, events, and historical characters that are referenced by major ancient historians such as Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny. Are there other reasons for us to believe that the New Testament writers told the truth? Yes, here are a few of them. Many mythological stories and tales of highly praised people following a pantheon of deities with the utmost respect and honor record human heroes who outsmarted the gods, overpowered the gods, and in some instances showed themselves to have held a higher moral standard than the gods, proving to the readers that mankind is better and in many ways far superior to their supernatural deities. Unlike the mythological tales of heroes who bear no flaws, the disciples of the New Testament shared many embarrassing details about themselves, their doubts, their disobedience, their pride, their cowardice, and even their hypocrisy in some cases. The New Testament writers did not sugarcoat Jesus' teaching, but left in the difficult and demanding lessons that Jesus taught that most people would have trouble taking in. The New Testament writers did not deny their witness testimony when persecuted, tortured, all under the threat of death. The disciples of Jesus were murdered for their account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. The deaths of these martyrs are further evidence of the trustworthiness of their testimony. But wait, what about Muslim martyrs? People die for their faiths every day. This is not the same thing. Yes, many people can die for their beliefs. However, the reason the deaths of Jesus' disciples are unique is because they died for what they have seen, not what they heard other people have seen. If the disciples lied about Jesus, if the disciples knew that Jesus did not resurrect from the dead, then there would be no reason to continue the lie under the threat of torture and death. We can put this through the Watergate test. In 1972, Richard Nixon, then President of the United States of America, conspiring with about a dozen other powerful people, couldn't keep a simple secret under wraps. Some of the most politically influential individuals weren't able to uphold a little white lie under a bit of legal scrutiny. All of them ended up confessing to the scandal. In contrast, more than a dozen of Jesus' followers who saw him resurrected underwent decades of persecution, long periods of imprisonment and torture, and finally experienced some of humanity's most twisted capital punishments ever imagined, never once denying their testimony that Jesus is the Son of God who was resurrected from the dead. And last but not least, the disciples had no ulterior motives to preach what they taught about Christ other than the fact that it was all true. The disciples received no riches, no political prestige, no honor in the towns they evangelized in, and certainly not a happy ending to their life story. To make matters worse, the disciples knew that a terrible fate awaited them, and yet they continued to share their faith about Jesus. All these factors led me to believe that the accounts the disciples presented were accurate and true. So, what exactly was their account of Jesus? Who was Jesus according to the Gospels? The character of Christ. Almost everyone who has ever heard of or read about Jesus of Nazareth considers him to be a great moral teacher. However, those who consider Jesus to be a great moral teacher, but reject Jesus' authority as Lord of all creation, have to deal with one problem which C.S. Lewis lays out in one of his best books, Mere Christianity, and that was that Jesus couldn't be a great moral teacher unless his claim to be God was true. Given what Jesus said about himself, about life, about the human condition, about the absolute moral standard, claiming himself to be God, to be one with God, to have the same authority as God, to do exactly as the prophets prophesied that God would do, Jesus would either have to be a liar, a lunatic, or Lord of everything. Either Jesus' claim to be God was true or false. If he were false, then there would only be two reasons for his falsehood. He either lied or he was delusional. If Jesus was a liar, meaning that he knew that his claims of being equal to God were false, then he, like everyone else, would have immediately confessed as he was scrutinized, mocked, abused, tortured, and threatened with death. Jesus was a Jew, and all the Jews knew that anyone who claimed to be God or equal to God, which is blasphemy, would face the death penalty. It wouldn't seem rational that a man would die for a sham of his own making, knowing fully well that it was a big fat lie, and that confessing to it would have saved his skin, literally. In fact, those of us who have studied interrogative torture performed by national security agencies, and in some cases local police stations, know that even innocent people will quote unquote confess to have committing a crime, to the extent that they will say anything that torturers want them to say as long as it stops the pain, as long as it ends the torture. Jesus had time after time, opportunity after opportunity, to confess that he was lying. But he didn't, because he knew he wasn't lying. Okay, but wait, maybe he didn't know that what he was saying was false. Maybe he did believe in the things he was saying. Maybe Jesus was a lunatic. He might have lost his sanity. Maybe Jesus made up the idea of being God himself. Jesus was probably out of his mind. After all, if some homeless guy walks up to you on the street and tells you that he's God, you think he was either hitting the bottle too hard or he was mentally impaired. And that might have applied to Jesus, except the evidence of his ministry and life shows that he is the complete opposite of a lunatic. In fact, psychologists consider Jesus' teaching as evidence of a sound and rational thinking person. Jesus was a person whose moral standard was higher than everyone else's. Skeptics find it very difficult to point to the words of Jesus and claim they are the ramblings of a madman. Many psychologists prescribe the lifestyle that Jesus laid out in his Sermon on the Mount to their patients to treat them for anxiety, paranoia, antisocial behaviors, and many more psychological conditions. Jesus' preaching, parables, principles, and princely composure all point to the most probable conclusion that Jesus was of sound mind. Jesus knew and understood what he was saying, and according to the Gospels, everything Jesus said was true. Jesus couldn't have been a liar, nor a lunatic. The only option we're left with is Jesus being Lord. But are there other pieces of evidence that would point to this same conclusion? Yes. The most notable exhibit of proof is Jesus is fulfilling over 350 prophecies of the Old Testament, which were written hundreds of years, and in some cases over 1,000 years before Jesus came to the scene. These include the genealogical prophecies that predict the Messiah was to be a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and King David. Many passages of the Old Testament predict that the Messiah would be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver and that the money would be cast on the floor of the temple. Out of all the cities in Israel, the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. The Messiah was to appear while the Temple of Jerusalem was still standing. Please note that the temple was destroyed in AD 70 and would not be rebuilt since. Scripture prophesied that God's people, the Jews, would reject the Messiah, but that it would be the Gentiles who would believe in him. You're still probably reviewing some of these 350 prophecies that are being shown on the screen. It's a lot to take in, but why would God go through all this trouble? Probably because he wanted to confirm to us through prophecy his plan to save humanity. But save humanity from what exactly? God is saving humanity from itself. We are the problem. In order to be with God, we must be like God, holy, full of love, light, truth, and righteousness. But we're not. We have fallen short of His glory. We have committed evils, whether small or great, it matters not. Just as the Creator is the source of goodness, so would the Creator of all things have to be the source of love. Therefore, if He were to create beings with the capacity to love, He would have to grant them free choice. This means that we as people have the free choice to either love God and choose Him, or hate God and reject Him. Furthermore, the true God of love would have to be respectful of our choices, with the possibility of certain exceptions applying if there are any. By respecting our choice, the God of the Bible would not force people to live with Him for all eternity. If a person rejects a loving relationship with God, then God would allow that person to enter an eternity without God. But as we previously established, if God is the source of all that is good, that is joy, love, peace, truth, meaning, and life, that means that an eternity without God would result in the lack of all these godly attributes, an eternity without joy, without love, without peace, truth, meaning, and life. An eternity without God is what we would call hell. Hell is a place or a state of being where people have voluntarily rejected God, not wanting a relationship with their Creator, the source of all truth, love, and joy. It's like walking away from a bonfire during a snowy winter. The further you walk away, the less of the fire's heat and light you experience. And when you stray away too far, you freeze to death in darkness. A tragic decision it is to walk away from the source of life. It would make sense in a world in which free choice is given. Evil, which is rebellion against the Creator, would be possible. Evil would stop at nothing to continue in rebellion and grow fiercer and stranger. Evil would pollute the minds of those who don't want to humble themselves and submit to the Creator. Evil would feed the dark desires of people to prevent them from coming to their Creator. Evil would be against the Creator, the true God. Thus, it would seem the true God is the one whom we would be most inclined to naturally hate. And so, to find which religion is the most hated, not just ignored, but truly ridiculed, mocked, cursed, and spat upon, may give us some clue as to which one leads to the true God of all creation. I think Judaism and Christianity bring a strong case for being the most oppressed religions in the world and throughout most of history. Don't get me wrong, there were many passages in the scriptures which I was very confused over. Today, there are very few passages that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Many times I became furious at the first glance contradictions I stumbled upon, not because these passages were confusing logically or that they were self contradicting, rather, it was due to my lack of knowledge. But the more I read the scriptures in a variety of translations and studied different commentaries, the more understanding and respect I developed towards the history, language, and spiritual ethics about the Hebrew God. In my study of the Bible, I found the explanation of our origin, identity, morality, meaning, and destiny to cohere with each other and coincide with logical consistency, empirical evidence, and experiential relevance. I'll go into more detail of my discoveries and future projects. This is just an outline of my experience investigating these matters. When I turned 16, I had a personal supernatural encounter with the God of the Bible. I didn't come to Christ just yet. That actually happened 2 years later. But I knew for sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Hebrew God was and is the true living God. But that story's for another time. I came to believe in God not through family tradition or community propaganda or false promises of a better future full of money and power. Instead, I came to learn about God through the nature that He created, the reliability of mathematics, the miracle of language, the unprovable and unexplainable origin of DNA, the honesty towards suffering, the beauty of music, the knowledge that I am a servant to whatever it is I value, and ultimately, my understanding as a limited and evil person knowing fully well that I do not meet the perfect standard of goodness. Here is one of my favorite quotes of C.S. Lewis from his book Surprised by Joy. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be a part of the show, find myself in such a violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never have known it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. But we do have eyes which show us the difference between darkness and light. We would be fools to close our eyes and claim that light doesn't exist. We harm ourselves and others by ignoring reality, and so it is also true for the source of goodness and thus justice. We all possess a moral compass that tells us to turn away from evil darkness and to walk towards goodness and light. When creating the world, the good Lord said, "Let there be light." When saving the world, Jesus said, "I am the light." I invite you to step into the light and walk with God. Let me share some of the best books that dive deeper on this topic. More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman L. Geisler and Frank Turek. Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design by Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, as well as his other book, Surprised by Joy. And of course, the New Testament. These are the reasons that led me to Christianity, and thus has guided my principles and values, my perspective, my position in my identity, life, morals, relationships, and all other matters. Jesus Christ has become the very center of my existence, and I hope you will come to know Jesus too. God made you special, and He loves you very much.